She was a mother, a nurse, a woman dedicated to saving lives. Every morning she walked through the doors of one of the most respected hospitals in the country, wearing the uniform of a caregiver, tending to children who needed her the most. She was known for her kindness, for the warmth in her voice, for the way she always went the extra mile for her patients. Her friends described her as reliable, compassionate, someone you could count on, whether you were a sick child in need of comfort or a coworker having a difficult day. To the outside world, she had it all: a stable job, a home, a family. But on April 3rd, 2019, everything changed. Inside her townhouse, paramedics arrived to a scene that none of them would forget. Susan Chen, the woman who had devoted her life to helping others, was gone. The cause of death? A massive hemorrhage. But the medical examiner would soon uncover something that went beyond a medical emergency, something that should never have happened. The person closest to her, the man she had shared her life with, was now at the center of a case that would shock an entire city. But was it an accident? A terrible mistake? Or was there more to the story? Tonight, we take you through the unsettling case of Susan Chen and the man who claimed to love her. Welcome to True Crime Files, where we take you inside the most haunting and complex cases, stories that leave behind questions, grief, and a search for justice. Here we go beyond the headlines, beyond the official statements, and piece together the lives affected by these tragedies. If you have an eye for the truth and a mind for mystery, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you never miss a story that needs to be told. Now let's go back to the case of Susan Chen, a woman whose life was dedicated to saving others, only for her own life to end in a way no one could have expected. What really happened behind closed doors? And how did the investigation lead to the person she trusted the most? Susan Chen spent her life in the service of others. As a nurse at Toronto's SickKids hospital, she worked long hours, caring for children at their most vulnerable. She was the kind of person who left an impact, not just on her patients, but on everyone who crossed her path. Colleagues admired her dedication, friends cherished her warmth, family members relied on her strength. Outside of work, Susan lived in a quiet townhouse in Toronto with her husband, Mansour Jalali. From the outside, their life seemed ordinary, a couple with shared history, routines, and responsibilities. But on the night of April 3rd, 2019, everything changed. Emergency responders were called to the home. Inside, they found Susan unresponsive. The woman who had spent her career fighting for others now needed saving herself. But it was too late. She was pronounced dead at the scene. At first, there were questions. Was it a medical emergency, an unexpected health complication? But as investigators looked closer, those questions turned into something more troubling. The cause of death, massive internal bleeding, was not what they expected. And what they would uncover in the following days would shift the case in a direction no one saw coming. Attention turned to the person closest to her, the man who had shared her life, the man who, just days later, would find himself in handcuffs. Mansour Jalali, her husband, was arrested, charged, and soon the truth about what happened inside that home would come to light. April 3rd, 2019 started like any other day. The streets of Toronto were busy, the world kept moving, and in a quiet townhouse on Bonus Avenue, Susan Chen was home. No one could have imagined that by the end of that night she would no longer be alive. At some point that evening, a call was made to emergency services. The voice on the other end of the line reported that Susan was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived at the scene within minutes, rushing through the doors, their minds focused on one thing: saving a life. But what they found inside was a woman beyond saving. Susan's body lay still. There were no signs of life. They followed every protocol, checking for any possibility that she could be revived, but there was nothing they could do. She was pronounced dead on the scene. At first, there was uncertainty. People die unexpectedly in their homes every day. Could it have been natural causes? A sudden illness, a medical condition that had gone undetected? But then, they took a closer look. Something wasn't right. Susan had suffered a severe gastrointestinal hemorrhage, internal bleeding so extensive that it had caused her death. But what caused that bleeding? That was the real question. The autopsy results left no room for doubt. This was not a medical event. This was not a sudden, unexplained tragedy. The injuries she sustained were not accidental. They were the result of trauma. And then, the most unsettling discovery of all. Evidence suggested Susan had been assaulted in the hours before her death. What was first thought to be a health emergency was now something else entirely. Investigators turned to the one person who had been with her that night, the person who had called for help, the person who should have been her protector. And suddenly this wasn't just a tragic death. It was the start of an investigation, a case that would reveal a truth so devastating, no one was prepared for what would come next. The moment the autopsy report came back, everything changed. What had first appeared to be a tragic and unexpected death was now something far more disturbing. The injuries Susan Chen sustained were not the result of illness. They were not caused by an accident. The medical examiner's findings pointed to something violent, something no one could ignore. Toronto police wasted no time. Investigators combed through Susan's life, speaking to friends, colleagues, and neighbors. They searched for anything that could explain what had happened inside that Bonus Avenue townhouse on the night of April 3rd. And as they dug deeper, a troubling pattern began to emerge. This was not the first time there had been signs of trouble in Susan's home. Interviews revealed that Susan had confided in those close to her. She had spoken of arguments, of tension behind closed doors. But what she never spoke about, at least not to many, was fear. If she was afraid, she kept it buried. If she was in danger, she endured it in silence. On April 6, 2019, just days after Susan's death, police made their move. Mansoor Jalali was arrested and charged. He was accused of something unthinkable, the assault that led to the death of his wife. As the case made its way to trial, new details emerged. Prosecutors laid out a disturbing timeline, presenting evidence that Susan had endured suffering before her final moments. Forensic findings showed that the trauma she sustained was not incidental, it was inflicted. The injury that caused her death was severe, and it was not the first time Jalali had exerted control over her. Susan's medical records revealed past injuries, things that may not have raised suspicion at the time, but now, under the harsh light of the investigation, painted a much darker picture. Old bruises, a pattern of harm, an invisible history of pain. In court, Jalali's behavior was erratic. He fired multiple lawyers, delaying proceedings. He lashed out, his outbursts disrupting the courtroom. He denied responsibility, shifting blame, insisting there had been no crime. His legal team argued that Susan's death was a medical misfortune, but the evidence said otherwise. The prosecution remained firm. Witnesses testified, experts explained the forensic details. The judge listened, the jury watched. And through it all, one fact remained. Susan was gone, and the person accused of taking her life was sitting just feet away, fighting to escape the consequences. The trial had been long, it had been painful. Every day in court, Susan Chen's family sat in quiet agony, listening to details no one should ever have to hear about someone they loved. They had already lost her. Now, they were forced to relive her final moments over and over as evidence was presented, arguments were made, and the weight of the truth settled over the courtroom. And then, after everything, a verdict. Mansoor Jalali was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, not the full measure of justice Susan's family had hoped for. But it was a conviction, and for the first time since that tragic night in April, there was certainty. Certainty that what had happened to Susan would not be dismissed, would not be ignored. The judge handed down the sentence, 10 years in prison, a decade behind bars. But for Susan's family, for those who had spent their days waiting, their nights grieving, it felt like a fraction of what was deserved. A life had been taken, a mother, a daughter, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, gone. And in return, the man responsible would serve just a handful of years before walking free again. During sentencing, the judge acknowledged the weight of the crime. But the court also considered other factors. Jalali's time in custody had not been easy. He had spent years awaiting trial, held in detention, where he had been attacked multiple times by other inmates. The conditions of his incarceration had been harsh, and the court took that into account. His sentence would reflect not just the crime, but the punishment he had already endured behind bars. Still, for Susan's loved ones, there was no real justice. No sentence could bring her back. No courtroom decision could erase the pain of losing her. Her family spoke through their grief, their words measured but heavy. They remembered Susan for the person she was, not just a victim, not just a name in a trial, but someone who had lived a life full of kindness, someone who had mattered. They talked about her dedication to her patients, the way she could comfort a sick child with just a smile. They spoke of her love for her family, how she had always been the one to bring people together. And now, she was gone, taken in a way no one could have imagined. Their voices trembled as they addressed the court. They talked about the emptiness her absence left behind, about the moments she would never get to see, holidays, birthdays, milestones that now meant nothing without her. And as the proceedings came to an end, there was only one question left. What now? Susan Chen was gone. Her story had been told. Her name had been spoken in court, written in headlines, whispered in grief. And for the man who took her life, the years ahead would be spent in a cell, counting down the days until he could walk free again. But for her family, there was no countdown, no release, no moment when the pain would suddenly stop. There was only the memory of Susan, and the life that should have never been taken away. Susan Chen should still be here. She should still be walking through the halls of SickKids Hospital, comforting her patients, going home to her family, living the life she worked so hard to build. But she isn't. Her story ended in a way that never should have happened. And the hardest part is knowing that Susan is not the only one. Every year, countless people suffer in silence behind closed doors. They go to work. They smile at neighbors. They send texts to friends. And all the while, they carry something no one can see. Fear, pain, the quiet, exhausting struggle of living with someone who is supposed to love them, but instead brings harm. Domestic violence does not always leave visible scars. It does not always look the way people expect it to. It can be slow, invisible to outsiders, hidden beneath routine and normalcy. It can take the form of words, controlling, threatening, eroding someone's sense of self piece by piece. It can be financial, isolating, cutting off every means of escape. It can be quiet moments of intimidation, or it can be loud, dangerous eruptions that leave no doubt about what is happening. But too often, it is ignored. Too often, people stay silent. They tell themselves it will get better, that maybe it was just a bad day, that maybe if they try harder, love more, endure longer, things will change. And sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And by the time the world takes notice, it's already too late. Susan's story is not just about one case, one tragedy. It is about all the stories like hers, the ones that never make the news, the ones that don't end with an arrest or a trial, the ones that fade into statistics, unseen and unheard. But it doesn't have to be this way. If you or someone you know is in a situation where they feel unsafe, there is help. There are organizations that offer support, that can provide resources, that can help find a way out. No one deserves to live in fear. No one deserves to feel trapped in their own home. Help is available, and sometimes the first step is simply reaching out. A phone call, a conversation, a moment of trust that can lead to something better, something safer. Susan Chen should still be here, and while nothing can change what happened to her, her story can serve as a reminder of the warning signs that go unnoticed, of the people who suffer in silence, and of the urgency to speak up, to listen, to believe those who need help before it's too late, because no one should ever have to face this alone. Susan Chen's story has been told. The details of her life, her work, her kindness, and her tragic end have been laid out. We have followed the investigation, the trial, the sentencing. We have seen how a life can be taken in an instant and how a family is left to pick up the pieces. But now, the question turns to you. What do you think about this case? About the investigation, the trial, the outcome? Was justice served? Or does a 10-year sentence feel like too little for a life lost? And beyond that, how do we, as a society, protect people like Susan before it's too late? How do we recognize the warning signs that often go unseen? How do we make sure that when someone is in danger, they feel safe enough to ask for help? If you have thoughts on this case, we want to hear them. Share your perspective in the comments. Was the legal system fair in its ruling? Could anything have been done differently? What can be learned from Susan's story? And if this video has made you think, if you believe this conversation is important, consider sharing it. Awareness is often the first step toward change. The more people understand the realities of cases like Susan's, the more we can work toward solutions, toward preventing stories like this from happening again. If you want to see more in-depth explorations of true crime cases, stories that deserve to be told, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss a new video, never miss the chance to examine the facts, to ask questions, to understand the lives behind the headlines. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And most of all, thank you for remembering Susan Chen, because no matter how much time passes, her story should never be forgotten.